In 1945, at the end of World War II, there were 198,000 registered motorcycles in the United States. That is the entire country. 198,000 machines. By 1960, that number had grown to 575,000. Still modest. Still a notch. Then something happened that the motorcycle industry had never seen before and has never quite seen since. Between 1960 and 1965, 5 years, the number of registered motorcycles in America surged from 575,000 to 1,382,000. It more than doubled. By 1971, it had surpassed 3 million. And as of 1974, Americans had registered a total of 5 million motorcycles on the country's roads and highways. 5 million motorcycles in a country of 210 million people. 1 for every 42 Americans in a decade and a half. What caused that? Several things happened at once, and understanding all of them is the only way to understand what the 1970s motorcycle culture actually was. Because the culture that formed around those 5 million bikes was shaped directly by who was buying them and why. The first force was Easy Rider. The 1969 film starring Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper did something no motorcycle manufacturer's advertising campaign had ever accomplished. It made the motorcycle into a symbol of freedom that reached people who had never considered owning one. The Captain America chopper with long forks, a raked frame, and stars and stripes paint became the most recognized motorcycle image in American history within weeks of the film's release. Demand for choppers specifically exploded. Custom builders who had been working out of garages for small local clienteles suddenly had national reputations and waiting lists. The second force was Honda's You Meet the Nicest People campaign, which had run through the 1960s and succeeded in stripping the outlaw stigma from motorcycles for a mainstream middle-class audience. By 1970, the cultural message had bifurcated. Riding was simultaneously outlaw freedom and wholesome transportation, and somehow both messages were pulling people in. The third force was the most important one for understanding the culture that formed. They were coming home from Vietnam. Between 1964 and 1973, approximately 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam. They came home in waves. And unlike the World War II generation, which came home to parades, the GI Bill, and a country that called them heroes, the Vietnam veterans came home to something that was, and I want to say this carefully and accurately, deeply complicated. Some came home to indifference. Some came home to outright hostility. Many came home to a country that did not know what to do with them and was not particularly interested in figuring it out. The 1973 recession hit the same year the last troops came home. Jobs were scarce. The skills they had spent years developing were not exactly in demand in a peacetime economy. And many of these men, young, disciplined, trained for high-stress environments, looking for something that made sense in a world that did not, found motorcycles. The Vietnam vet's MC would later put it in a single sentence that I think is one of the most honest descriptions of that moment in American history. They said, "We went away as patriots and returned as outlaws." The motorcycle did not cause that transformation, but it absorbed it. The machine became the place where men who felt rejected by their own country could still build something, belong to something, and move through a landscape on their own terms. To understand the 1970s motorcycle culture, you have to understand what the machines actually were. Because the relationship between rider and machine in that era was completely different from what it is today. The difference is not about quality. The difference is about what the machine demanded of you. The dominant American motorcycle of the 1970s was the Harley-Davidson, specifically the Shovelhead V-twin that powered everything from the Sportster to the Electra Glide. The Shovelhead had been in production since 1966, and it was, by the standards of the era, a powerful and characterful engine that rewarded riders who understood it and punished those who did not. The 1970 Harley-Davidson FLH Electra Glide sold for somewhere between $2,500 and $2,900 new. The Sportster was around $2,000. A factory worker in a manufacturing job earning the median industrial wage of roughly $7,500 per year in 1970 could buy a new Sportster for about 3 months of gross income. A new Harley was genuinely attainable for a working-class rider who chose to prioritize it. Now here's the part of the Harley story in the 1970s that the official brand history tends to gloss over, and I personally think deserves to be stated clearly. In 1969, the founding family sold Harley-Davidson to American Machine and Foundry, AMF, a company whose primary expertise was bowling equipment. AMF pushed Harley's factories to double their output. Production doubled. Quality control did not keep pace. The result was that as many as 30% of the vehicles coming off the assembly line were incomplete. Workers went on strike, a 100-day strike, unhappy with management decisions that they felt were destroying the product they built with pride. Dealers received bikes that were not fully assembled and sometimes had to complete the work themselves on the showroom floor. Riders bought new Harleys and immediately started fixing things that should not have needed fixing. The nicknames that attached themselves to AMF era Harleys tell you everything about what riders thought. Hardly drivable, Harley-Davidson, Hogley Ferguson. Harley's market share in the super heavyweight category had been 80% in 1969. By 1979, it was 20%. The Japanese manufacturers had moved in while Harley was building bikes that leaked oil and stalled. But here's the thing about that story that gets missed every time it is told as a simple corporate failure narrative. The riders who bought those AMF Harleys and dealt with the problems, they fixed them. They learned every system. They developed deep diagnostic knowledge from necessity. They built relationships with independent mechanics who knew the shovel head the way a surgeon knows anatomy. And many of those riders will tell you today that owning an imperfect machine that demanded your attention was a better education in motorcycles than owning a perfect one would have been. The Japanese machines told a completely different story. In 1969, Honda released the CB750, the first true superbike, and it was faster, smoother, and more reliable than anything Harley was building. In 1972, Kawasaki released the Z1, 900 cubic centimeter inline 4, which embarrassed the American machines in every performance metric. Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki, and Kawasaki were offering better engineered, more efficient, lower cost motorcycles throughout the 1970s. And riders who did not have brand loyalty to Harley were buying them without hesitation. The result was a 1970s motorcycle landscape that was genuinely diverse in a way that American motorcycle culture has not been since. You had Harley loyalists who would ride nothing else and could fix anything on the machine by hand. You had Japanese bike riders who chose their machines for performance and reliability. You had custom builders working across both platforms. And you had somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 million registered motorcycles on American roads by the middle of the decade, the highest per capita motorcycle ownership in American history. The image of the 1970s motorcycle culture that the industry would like you to have is the factory product, the showroom floor, the advertised machine. That image is almost entirely false. The culture was built in garages. It was built by men with no formal training and no backing who figured things out, because figuring things out was the only option available to them. And a few of those men became so good at what they did in those garages that their work defined what American motorcycles look like for generations. Arlen Ness is the most important figure in that story, and I personally think he is one of the most underappreciated Americans in the history of manufacturing. Not motorcycle manufacturing. Because what Ness did was not just build beautiful motorcycles, he built an entire industry around the idea that production machines were starting points, not finished products. Ness grew up in San Lorenzo, California. He worked as a pin setter at a bowling alley and later as a postal worker and furniture mover. He played semi-professional bowling and used his tournament earnings to buy his first motorcycle in 1963, a 1947 Harley-Davidson Knucklehead for $300. He took it to his home garage in San Leandro and started customizing it. He had no formal training. He had a spray gun and a vision. The first customized Ness bike won awards at motorcycle shows. Riders started asking him to work on their bikes. By the early 1970s, his business had grown enough that he moved from his home garage to a storefront on East 14th Street in San Leandro. He created his first catalog, actually, as he described it, a list that his wife Bev typed up with handwritten prices next to each item. What Ness built in those years was not the Easy Rider chopper. He explicitly rejected that direction. The Easy Rider aesthetic was tall, high handlebars reaching for the sky, extended forks pushing the front wheel far out in front. Ness went the opposite direction. He pioneered what became known as the digger style or lowrider chopper, frames slammed to the ground, gooseneck steering heads, flat handlebars, minimal seat, angular fuel tank following the frame line. He was drawing from California's drag racing scene rather than the chopper counterculture. The result was machines that looked like they were going fast standing still. Every major custom builder after Ness was either building on what he established or consciously reacting against it. He had done from a bowling alley paycheck and a home garage what no corporation with a design department and an engineering team had managed to do. He created a genuinely new American aesthetic for the motorcycle. The builders who worked outside the coast had their own sensibilities. In the Northeast, Indian Larry, who would come to wider fame later, but whose roots were in the 1970s New York scene, pioneered what you might call the urban survival chopper. Narrow enough to split gridlock traffic, low enough to navigate tight spaces, loud enough to announce its presence to drivers who were not looking. These were not show bikes, they were tools. In the Midwest, in shops scattered across manufacturing towns where skilled metalworkers and machinists had the background to do precision fabrication, custom building had a different character again. More engineering, less art. Machines built to a standard of function that the California aesthetic sometimes sacrificed. The common thread across all of it was that the people building these motorcycles had skin in the game that went beyond money. They were building their identities. The machine was a statement about who you were, where you came from, what you believed, what you were willing to work for. No two bikes were the same because no two builders were the same. The word club has accumulated so much mythology, positive and negative, that it is almost impossible to use accurately. So let me be precise about what the 1970s motorcycle club landscape actually looked like, because it was considerably more complicated than either the romanticized version or the criminal organization version that tended to dominate the storytelling. The outlaw club world was real and was not romantic. The Hells Angels had patched over the Aliens chapter in New York City in December 1969. By the mid-1970s, the New York chapter had become one of the club's largest and most powerful in the country. What had started as post-war rebels on motorcycles had, by the 1970s, evolved into something considerably darker. Organizations involved in drug distribution, contract violence, and territorial warfare with rival clubs. The biker wars of the 1970s were not mythologized outlaw freedom. They were real conflicts over real criminal enterprise that resulted in real deaths. But the outlaw world was not the motorcycle club world. It was a fraction of it, and the fraction it represented had an outsized cultural footprint that obscured the much larger community underneath. The AMA, the American Motorcyclists Association, had hundreds of sanctioned clubs across the country. These were the clubs that organized charity rides, that showed up to support veterans events, that ran the Daytona Bike Week activities and the Sturgis Rally festivities that were not about criminality. These clubs provided the same function for their members that the outlaw clubs provided for theirs: brotherhood, belonging, a shared identity built around a shared passion without the criminal element. Sturgis itself tells the story of how the community grew through the decade. In 1970, the rally drew 3,000 riders. 3,000. By 1975, it had expanded to a 7-day event and was drawing tens of thousands. By the end of the decade, 30,000 riders per year were making the journey to the Black Hills of South Dakota. What had been a regional racing event organized by the Jack Pine Gypsies Motorcycle Club was becoming a national pilgrimage, a place where riders from every region and every background showed up and recognized each other as part of the same culture. That recognition, the nod between riders on the road, the unspoken acknowledgement that you are part of something, was the social fabric of the 1970s motorcycle culture. It required nothing from you beyond showing up on a bike. No brand loyalty required, no club affiliation required, no particular level of wealth or status required. You rode. You were part of it. The 1970s machines we are talking about, the AMF-era Harleys, the CB750s, the Z1s, the custom choppers, represent some of the best value in the current vintage and used market. Section 5 of the 2026 Motorcycle Buyer's Bible has the complete vintage buyer's guide with the specific model years to target and the specific model years to avoid across every platform from this era. Section 7 has the pre-purchase inspection checklist for a 1970s two-stroke or a shovel head. The compression test and the oil system inspection are the two checkpoints that tell you everything. Link in the description. Was $97, now $9. The Vietnam veteran motorcycle community is, I personally think, the most important and least understood chapter of 1970s American motorcycle history. These were men who came home carrying something they could not fully explain to anyone who had not been there. The motorcycle gave them something to do with it. The road gave them somewhere to put it. The club gave them people who did not need it explained. The Vietnam veterans who flooded into motorcycle culture after 1973 brought something specific with them that changed the community's character. They had operational discipline, the ability to execute, to plan, to look after the people next to them under pressure. Clubs built around veteran membership ran with a structure and a seriousness that purely recreational clubs sometimes lacked. The Rolling Thunder event, which would eventually become one of the largest veteran gatherings in American history, had its spiritual roots in this period. Veterans who felt invisible to the country that had sent them to war, finding visibility and voice through the culture of riding. The specific numbers tell you what this meant economically and culturally. By the mid-1970s, Vietnam veterans represented a significant portion of the 5 million registered motorcycle owners. These were not wealthy buyers, they were working-class men, many of them struggling to find jobs in a 1973 recession economy, who prioritized the motorcycle as a machine and a community over other consumer choices. The dealerships that understood this demographic, that spoke to them directly, that stocked the machines they wanted, rather than the machines the manufacturers wanted to push, that had mechanics on staff who had also been in country and spoke the same language, those dealerships built loyalties that lasted decades. The dealerships that did not understand this demographic lost them immediately to the shop across town that did. This is the demographic reality that the industry's official history rarely discusses because it complicates the clean narrative of consumer demand and product development. The Vietnam veteran motorcycle buyer was not a lifestyle consumer. He was a man who had been through something that changed him permanently, and who found in the motorcycle and its community the specific combination of practical utility, mechanical engagement, and genuine belonging that he needed. When the rolling memorial runs began, when groups of veterans started riding together specifically to honor their fallen and to make visible the community that the country had preferred to ignore, those rides drew riders from both sides of the club world. Outlaw patch holders and AMA members and independent riders and military veterans rode the same roads for the same reason. The motorcycle was the common ground that the rest of the culture had not provided. I personally think that is the most important thing to understand about the 1970s motorcycle culture. Not the choppers, not the AMF controversy, not the Japanese machines. The specific role that motorcycles played for a specific generation of American men who came home from a war that their country had decided to forget. By the mid-1970s, the motorcycle communities had 5 million registered bikes and real political weight for the first time in its history. And the political fight that erupted in this period set the template for every regulatory battle in motorcycle culture that has happened since. In 1966, Congress passed the Highway Safety Act, which included provisions that could effectively require states to mandate helmet use as a condition of receiving federal highway funding. By the early 1970s, 47 states had enacted mandatory helmet laws under this pressure. The rider response was organized and fierce. This was not a fringe campaign. This was a mainstream motorcycle community, millions of riders, not thousands, mobilizing against a law that many saw as the first major encroachment of the government into a decision that should belong to the individual rider. The argument was simple. The risk of riding without a helmet falls on the rider. No one else is endangered by my uncovered head. The government's interest in my personal safety does not override my personal liberty. The political pressure worked. In 1976, Congress removed the financial penalty on states that did not enforce helmet laws. Within 2 years, 28 states had repealed their mandatory helmet requirements. It was one of the most successful grassroots political campaigns in motorcycle history, and it was run by riders who organized through their clubs, their rallies, and their shared understanding that what happened in one state would eventually reach theirs. I am not going to tell you whether mandatory helmet laws are right or wrong. I personally wear a helmet every time I ride, and I have for years. But the political fight over helmets in the 1970s matters to the story because it demonstrated something about the motorcycle community that is often overlooked. When the community was genuinely united around a shared interest, not divided by brand loyalty, not fragmented by marketing positioning, not sorted into demographic categories by the industry, it was capable of winning. That unity was a product of the specific culture the 1970s built. The 5 million registered bikes were not 5 million individual consumers. They were a community. The helmet fight proved it. The oil crisis of 1973 added another dimension to the motorcycle's cultural and practical position in America. When OPEC cut oil production and gas lines formed at stations across the country, suddenly the motorcycle's fuel efficiency became a serious practical consideration for people who had previously thought of it purely as a lifestyle choice. A Honda CB750 that could travel 50 miles on a gallon of gas was not just a freedom machine. It was a sensible response to a crisis that nobody had seen coming. Motorcycle registrations, which had already been climbing through the late 1960s and early 1970s, got another push from the oil crisis. People who had not previously thought about riding started thinking about it. The 5 million registration number by 1974 reflects both the cultural momentum from Easy Rider and the practical calculation of fuel costs that the oil crisis introduced. But the oil crisis did something else to motorcycle culture that gets less attention than the registration numbers. It validated the working class practicality that had always been at the foundation of the culture, the idea that a motorcycle was not a luxury or a lifestyle statement, but a machine that solved real transportation problems more efficiently than the alternatives. The man who bought a CB 750 because it cost less to run than his car brought a different relationship to the machine than the man who bought a chopper because he wanted to look like Peter Fonda. The practical buyer tended to maintain his machine, to understand it, to develop the mechanical literacy that the culture at its best had always demanded. The oil crisis, by expanding the practical buyer cohort, may have done more for the quality of the average 1970s motorcycle rider than all the cultural momentum of Easy Rider. The practical case for motorcycle ownership that the oil crisis established in 1973 is the same case that informs smart buying decisions today. The 2026 Motorcycle Buyer's Bible documents the real total cost of ownership across different platform categories: fuel economy, maintenance costs, insurance, and the OEM tire situation, where the factory rubber wears 30 to 50% faster than the replacement market version of the same tire. Section 1 covers the 2026 market conditions where the best buying opportunity in 15 years exists right now. Link in the description. Was $97, now $9. By the late 1970s, something was changing. It did not announce itself. There was no single moment. But the culture that had built itself from the ground up over the course of a decade was beginning to calcify in ways that would eventually hollow it out. The Japanese manufacturers had created something that custom builders had not fully anticipated: the universal Japanese motorcycle. Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki were producing reliable, affordable, comfortable machines that required almost no maintenance knowledge from the riders. The CB 750, the Z1, the GS 750, these were not demanding machines. They did not need to be understood. They needed to be ridden. And that was genuinely appealing to a rider who wanted transportation rather than a project. The problem was not that those machines existed. The problem was what their dominance began to do to the relationship between rider and machine across the whole culture. When the average rider no longer needed to understand how the engine worked to keep it running, the average rider stopped learning. The deep mechanical knowledge that had characterized the working class motorcycle community, the ability to diagnose by sound, to fabricate a part when the OEM part was unavailable, to solve a problem on the side of the road with what you had in your pocket, began to erode. Harley-Davidson's response to Japanese competition through the late 1970s was to lean harder into identity rather than engineering. You were not buying a Harley for its performance numbers. You were buying it for what it meant. That repositioning would eventually save the company after the 1981 management buyout from AMF and the extraordinary turnaround that followed. But it also completed the transformation of the Harley from working-class machine to something else. Something that cost more, required less mechanical engagement from its rider, and carried an increasingly expensive set of cultural associations that made it aspirational rather than accessible. A new 1976 Electra Glide was $3,375. Adjusted for real wage growth, that bike was still attainable for a working man who prioritized it. But the trajectory of Harley pricing from that point forward would take the flagship of American motorcycle manufacturing further and further from the working class rider who had been its natural constituency. The chopper era burned itself out around this time as well. The extreme machines that had defined the visual language of early 1970s motorcycle culture, forks stretched to impossible lengths, frames raked at angles that made handling genuinely difficult, bars reaching skyward, had pushed the form as far as it could reasonably go. Riders who had been building for expression were ready for machines that were also actually practical. Disc brakes, electric starters, suspension that worked. The visual extremism of the early chopper era gave way to machines that were still custom, still individual, but were also riddable on a long highway day without your wrists aching. The custom builders who survived that transition were the ones who understood that the style had to serve the rider, not just make a statement. Arlen Ness understood this. His digger style had never sacrificed rideability for visual drama the way the extreme choppers had. The builders who had built purely for shock value found that shock value has a short shelf life. By 1980, when 40,000 riders arrived in Sturgis, a number that would have been unimaginable at the start of the decade, the rally was beginning to look less like a gathering of riders and more like an event. The vendors were multiplying. The entertainment was becoming a reason to attend in itself. The motorcycle was still there, still the central object, but it was sharing the stage with things that had nothing to do with riding. That is not a complaint. Growth is growth. But something in the texture of the community changed when it became large enough to be a market rather than just a culture. When the brands recognized that riders were a demographic with money to spend, the riders stopped being the people who built the culture and started being the people the culture was being built for. The man who had been coming to Sturgis since 1970, when there were 3,000 riders, and they all knew each other by face, if not by name, he was still there in 1980. But the event around him had changed in ways that he felt without always being able to name. More cameras, more merchandise, more people wearing the clothes rather than riding the bikes. The culture he had built and belonged to was becoming something that other people could buy their way into without earning their place. And he understood, without quite saying it out loud, that this was both proof of the culture's success and the beginning of the end of what had made it specific. The 1970s motorcycle culture was specific because it was built from the ground up by people who had no other options. The Vietnam veteran who needed a community that would have him. The working-class factory worker who needed a machine he could afford to buy and maintain himself. The garage builder who needed a creative outlet that his day job could not provide. The rider who needed a country that moved on his terms after years of moving on everyone else's. None of those people were demographic categories. They were specific individuals with specific needs that the motorcycle culture met in ways that nothing else available to them quite did. When the culture became large enough to be marketed to, the marketing necessarily turned those specific individuals into demographic categories. The result was a culture that looked larger from the outside and felt smaller from the inside. That feeling, the specific sense of something being lost even as the numbers grew, is the emotional undertow of the late 1970s motorcycle community that the history books tend to miss. Not anger, not resistance. Just the quiet recognition that the thing you were part of was not quite the thing it had been, and that there was no reversing that without reversing the growth that had made it visible. The 5 million registered motorcycles that were the decade's defining statistic were also its defining irony. The culture that had built itself in the margins, that had drawn its character from being outside the mainstream, had become too large to be outside anything. Looking back at the 1970s motorcycle culture from 50 years out, the specific achievement that endures is not the machines, or the rallies, or the custom building, or the political victories. The specific achievement is the knowledge culture. The working class rider of the 1970s who understood his shovelhead the way a surgeon understands anatomy, who could diagnose a problem by the sound it made and fix it with tools he carried in a saddlebag, was carrying knowledge that had been earned through necessity and that cannot be purchased or inherited. The custom builder in San Leandro who built an industry from bowling alley earnings and a spray gun was demonstrating that genuine creative vision, applied with genuine technical skill, produces something that corporate design departments cannot replicate regardless of their budget. The Vietnam veteran riding community was building a model of genuine brotherhood, not performance of brotherhood, not branded brotherhood, genuine brotherhood, forged in shared experience and maintained through mutual obligation, that the culture they returned to had largely forgotten how to produce. All of these things were happening simultaneously in the 1970s because the circumstances that produced them existed simultaneously. The AMF shovelhead that forced mechanical knowledge. The economic environment that made the motorcycle accessible to working class buyers who could not afford alternatives. The Vietnam veterans who brought discipline and genuine need to a culture that could absorb both. The custom builders who had nothing but skill and vision to offer and produce masterworks. That specific convergence will not happen again because the circumstances that produced it will not recur. But the knowledge it produced is not lost. It lives in the riders who built it and in the riders they taught. It shows up at vintage motorcycle events where a man in his 70s talks to a man in his 30s about a 1974 shovelhead as though the machine were a mutual friend they have both known for decades. It shows up in the garage where someone is rebuilding something because rebuilding it is the only way to understand it. The 1970s motorcycle culture is not history in the sense of something that happened and is now complete. It is a foundation. The culture that built itself in garages and on highways in a decade of social upheaval, political conflict, and economic stress produced knowledge, community, and character that is still being lived out by people who were shaped by it. That is what the 1970s was. Not the choppers, not the outlaw mythology, not the Japanese machines arriving to embarrass the American ones, the foundation.